Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to acknowledge the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of this nation and acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands, the Jabagai, Iragadinji, Gumarayidinji, on which our campuses and study centres are located. We pay our respects to ancestors and elders past, present and future. And JCU is committed to honouring the Australian Aboriginal Island people's unique culture and spiritual relations to the lands, waters and seas and their rich contribution to JCU. So now I'd like to introduce with great pleasure our Associate Professor Conrad Hoskin, who's come up from Townsville today to present our test seminar. Conrad is one of those amazing field biologists that if there is an animal anywhere, he can find it. Even when you don't think there's animals around you. Conrad's by far one of the best field biologists I think we've had at JCU in a long time. His particular interest is in tropical biodiversity, and much of his research is on reptiles and frogs. He did his PhD at UQ and a DECRA Fellowship, followed by a DECRA Fellowship at ANU and an ABRS Fellowship at JCU. I don't know what an ABRS Fellowship is.
It's a branch of the federal government to do with biodiversity research.
Oh, great, thank you. Should have looked that up before I came. And has been an academic at JCU for 10 years. Well, same. Conrad's also an Honorary Research Fellow at the Queensland Museum. He's published 100 papers, 2 field guides, and I think some apps, and some field apps, which are really cool. And obviously contributed to many books and written many popular articles. And he's won a Eureka Prize and is a current recipient of the Queensland Natural History Award. So let's give him a warm welcome. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Susan. Thank you, everyone, for coming in person, and thank you for those that are attending on Zoom. I will be talking about species discoveries and what they tell us about the past, present and future of Queensland's rainforests. I would just want to extend my acknowledgement from the where we gathered here, but also to the Townsville area, the Bindal Wulgaruka people, which is where I live and work day to day. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands on which the research that I'll present today was conducted. And I extend that respect to all First Nations people in the audience. Okay, so firstly, my talk today will be about discovering species, and I want to first clarify what that means. By discovering species, I mean finding, describing and naming new species to science, in particular the branch of science called taxonomy. I don't mean that I'm the first person to ever encounter these species necessarily, because people have been living on these lands for thousands of years, many thousands of years, and it's highly likely that many of these species were known, or these creatures were known to some degree at some point in time. So that's discovering a species. That's what I mean when I'm saying that. I also want to point out that discovering species is really important. So for me, the greatest benefit of species discovery is that that species can get conservation attention if it needs it. So that's the single most important thing to me, and that's by it can then be assessed on threatened species lists and then come under conservation attention as required. It also can be part of lists that help us decide on conservation priorities to do with areas of high diversity or high endemism and that sort of thing. Species, as you all know, are like the core units we use in biological research. They're really important where we use wildlife, like fisheries. And they really help us understand the past, present and future, because by understanding a species in group in detail and having this really rich catalogue of diversity, we can understand and look at why certain species have persisted in areas, some have gone extinct, and we can use that information to assess the future. The other thing that species discoveries are really good for is that they get a lot of media attention, and that's great because it brings a lot of awareness of the incredible wildlife we have to the general public, and hence generates care. Okay, so I've always been obsessed with wildlife. It's always been a thing that really, really matters to me. It's my sister and I when we were young in Namibia, and back in the days when it was deemed sensible for small kids to go in with big cats. And looking at the size of my sister there, it's probably lucky that the cheetah attacked mum's handbag and not her. I was well defended with a porcupine quill, so I was all good. And then there we are years later looking at tadpoles in a stream in the Bunya Mountains in southeast Queensland. So that's always been my thing. I've just been really, really intrigued by wildlife and fascinated by the diversity we have out there. Some point along the way in my teenage years, I found out you could actually do that for a job, which I then went for wholeheartedly. And I did a Bachelor of Science, honours, and then years later a PhD at UQ on biodiversity research, particularly around speciation, so how species form. And as Susan mentioned, I then had two 3-year government fellowships, one of which I brought to JCU, and then I've been working here as an academic for the last 10 years. My research program is very broad, but it's all around biodiversity, in particular, how we discover and describe all the diversity that's out there, how it forms and adapts through time, and its future, so conservation biology. So I mostly do number 3 now, but today's talk is a lot about number 1, so species discoveries. Okay, so I'll focus today. I'll work on various groups, but I do a lot of work on reptiles and frogs, and that's what I'll focus on today. And I'll talk about some interesting species that I've had the privilege of being part of the discovery and naming, and what they tell us about biogeography, and also what they highlight the fact that we have so many of these highly localized endemic species in Queensland that have a whole range of threats to them now, and some of the conservation challenges. Okay, so you guys will all be pretty familiar with Queensland's rainforests, a variety of different rainforest types wrapped up in the red on that map. You've got these kind of core areas that everyone knows reasonably well. That's the rainforests of southeast Queensland, the Younger Mid-East Queensland region, the pretty large extensive areas of the wet tropics that form that core area, and then the quite fragmented rainforests of Cape York. So those are the sort of like often considered the core areas. But there's a lot of these tiny little isolated patches down the Queensland coast too. And as I'll show in this talk, a lot of those tiny little isolated patches of rainforest have had persistent rainforest creatures and are really important as well. Okay, so my honours research was in one of the core areas in the wet tropics up here in North Queensland, an area you guys all know well. And I worked on Cofix frogs, these interesting little nursery frogs that are found through the wet tropics rainforest. There's a few interesting things about them. One is that there's many species and they often have very small distributions. They have a pattern of diversity and distributions, a bit more like an invertebrate really. Lots of single mountain or single mountain range endemics, and most of the species are upland species. They're the most diverse of our vertebrate genera in the wet tropics. They're very small rainforest dwellers, most of them, but I'll point out some exceptions later. And a really cool thing about them is that they're terrestrial breeders. They don't need standing water to breed. So although they're only typically in the tops of the mountains, once you get up there, they're pretty evenly common through the forest because they don't need streams and they don't need ponds to breed. Their tadpoles develop entirely within the eggs. So clutch size is small, typically 10 to 20 eggs. And they're called nursery frogs because the male then guards that clutch and associates with it while the tadpoles over weeks are developing in those eggs and then hatch out. So it's a really interesting form of breeding biology. My honours project was on mountaintop speciation in these. So I was putting together a genetic phylogeny, which I won't talk about now, but you will see that phylogeny, new version of it later. But during that, I sort of discovered my first species, and that turned out to be a really interesting and conservation significant species discovery. So when I was working through the Queensland Museum specimens, there's at that time, a fairly widespread species, Cofix cancinus, across the northern mountaintops. Small, even brown little guy with a beautiful slow tapping call. When I was at the museum, the main jar had that creature, the paratypes were that creature. But then when I picked up the holotype jar, there was a frog that just did not look like the same species to me, a larger, snub-nosed, quite patterned frog. And it was collected from up high on Thornton Peak. So I thought, oh, well, look, it looks like there's 2 species described as one here. And that next summer, I walked up Thornton Peak, Wundu, in the pouring rain. And as I went up the mountain, there was all the beautiful slow tapping from once I was over 700 meters elevation, all the usual guys that I was used to. And then as I got higher and higher, still those guys. And I thought, oh, well, maybe that was just an aberrant individual. And then once I got above 1,100 meters, I started hearing this beautiful rattling sound coming from through the forest. And side by side were these two different species that had been described as one. So that was pretty cool. It turns out Cofix concinus, the beautiful nursery frog, is the name that was then associated just with that Thornton Peak one, because that's the name was attached to that holotype, that individual. And then I gave a name to the rest of those populations, the more widespread one is Cofix enigma. Cofix concinus, the beautiful nursery frog, is very interesting in that it's one of the many high-altitude upland endemics we have in the wet tropics, and it exemplifies this issue of sky islands, the problems we have currently arising with climate change issues. So Cofix concinus lives above 1,100 metres elevation on Thornton Peak, Wundu, not below it. You have to get above that elevation into these cool, moist, low seasonality environments that are these mountaintops. It's the same environments that have various other Cofix frogs, a whole lot of interesting plants and invertebrates that are high elevation, lemurroid ringtails, golden bowerbirds, populations of spotted-tailed quolls, etc. These sky islands are just these cool, moist refuges of an environment that was once much more widespread in Australia and is now basically contracted up to these mountaintops. And the concern, of course, with that is climate change, not just the gradual warming, but particularly the extreme events like heat waves and droughts. So I've got a bunch of research projects going with my students in my lab, and some of the things we're looking at is whether we can see that there's been elevational shifts in these species compared to historic distributional data across elevations. One of the things that could make these frogs particularly susceptible to climate change is that terrestrial breeding strategy. It might not just be that the adults are susceptible to heat waves or droughts or warming. It could be that the larval stage in those eggs could be particularly susceptible because it's not buffered by water in a stream or a pond or something like that. Many of these species, these Cofix nursery frogs now dominate the critically endangered species lists for EPBC for Australia. The one thing that could be beneficial to them is that they don't have great spatial area requirements. So relatively cool, moist microhabitats across these mountains could be useful to them. Rocky areas, a particular aspect compared to another, all that kind of thing. So we have projects going, looking at the role of microhabitats as cool, moist refuges as well. So it's an uncertain future for these species, but stay tuned for projects by Ellen, Emma, Geordie and Nick out of the lab addressing some of these climate change research questions. Okay, so that was a species discovery in the sense that I initially made that in a museum collection, and it led to the description of a species that's now one of the real flagship mountaintop conservation priorities in the wet tropics. Various modelling and expert opinion suggest that that beautiful nursery frog and the mountaintop nursery frog on Mount Lewis could be our two vertebrates that are probably may go extinct first. Okay, so during my honours, I also became very interested in these geckos, these super funky geckos called leaf-tailed geckos. They are big, impressive, prickly geckos of the rainforest. They're in a family called Carphodactylidae. It's leaf-tails, knobtails, and some other interesting geckos. It's the only reptile family that is truly endemic to Australia. It's not even in New Guinea. Really ancient things. Like those species shown there, the divergences between any of them are millions of years. So these geckos were probably widespread across Australia when rainforests were extensive, and there's been a story of gradual extinctions through time and contraction and persistence in the best of the rainforest refugia. So when I was first getting into research in Queensland here, two species in mid-east Queensland, Phylloris ossa and Isis, had been discovered north of Pakai, and I thought that's super cool, like in these tiny little isolates, and you know, naming these species in this day and age, that's really exciting. So I was driving up and down the Queensland coast a lot at that time from UQ to do wet tropics research. And I started eyeing off a lot of these isolates up the coast. And the one that really stood out to me was Mount Elliot, south of Townsville. It's a 1,200 metre high elevation mountain with rainforest on the top. I just thought, you know, it's such a persistent looking environment there. How could it not have retained one? And also sufficiently isolated from other rainforest areas that it's more likely to have its own thing rather than shared. So there's Mount Elliot, much more familiar to people in Townsville. This is from the centre of town. It's a big mountain area looming over town. You can see on this image here just how isolated it is by dry habitat types from the wet tropics and from the Mid-East Queensland rainforest. So I started dropping in there every so often when I went by and exploring Mount Elliot, trying to find a leaf-tailed gecko. And the first couple of times was unsuccessful. And then on my third attempt, standing in exactly this spot, it got dark. I turned around. I just hadn't gone high enough, basically. Turned around and sitting on a rock in the spotlight was beautiful red eye shine. And I went over and there was this big, impressive leaf-tailed gecko on the rock. So that was super exciting. And there it is. They're big. I mean, that gecko is sort of 15 centimetres long, much bigger than a gecko on your house, for example. Really cool geckos. Everything's amazing about these guys. They lay their eggs. It can take like 100 days for those eggs to hatch. It's all this really slow process of life. I named it the Mount Elliot leaf-tailed gecko, Phylloris M. Nicola. Interestingly, genetically, this species' closest relative is not the other leaf-tails in Queensland. Its closest relative is the single Phylloris that's not in Queensland, the one down on the Sydney sandstones. So there's basically the Salturius ones, the Queensland Phylloris, and then there's these two highly divergent species, which points to the sort of deep biogeographic story behind this, where this probably involves a whole lot of extinction of species in between with all those, the contraction of wet cooler forests. So it's an amazingly unique species sitting just on Mount Elliot. So that added an important and interesting species to the map of leaf-tailed geckos. And it also started to expose how unique Mount Elliot is. So I then found a skink up there too. That was a new species. Another two skinks that are very localized, but have their distribution primarily based around Mount Elliot. And then there's a frog that's only right up the top there, another one of these nursery frogs. There's a Euasticus crayfish, a pelican spider. There's so many unique things sitting on one mountain as the Sky Island. And that's in Townsville area, where you can stand up there on these moss-covered boulders in this lovely high-altitude rainforest and just look out through at the baking hot sort of savanna stuff that's all around Mount Elliot. It's truly incredible how these species have persisted in that place to the present. So Mount Elliot is now recognised as a bit of a endemism hotspot, gets more conservation attention, and it's also interesting biogeographically because the species there are a really interesting mix of allied to the wet tropics fauna or the Mid-East Queensland fauna. So it's a bit of a mixed area. Okay, I then started my PhD on hybrid zones in the wet tropics, and that's kind of like a seminar in itself, but I'll just pull out one interesting thing from that, and that is that the result of all that, which I'll show you in a very abbreviated version, is that not all species in these Queensland rainforests are really old. I discovered during this research a species that's probably formed in the last 10,000 years, a very young species. So the green-eyed tree frog was the topic of that, Latoria serrata. It's one of the many very common wet tropics rainforest reptiles and frogs. There's a whole bunch of rainforest reptiles and frogs that are found all through the wet tropics, but most of them show something truly intriguing when you look at them genetically. So the distribution of green-eyed tree frogs is all through this dark green from Townsville through Cairns to Cooktown. But in this case, taking tiny little skin samples off the toe pads and running them genetically across all those populations shows something really interesting. And that is that the populations in the north of the wet tropics, those shaded in blue here, are highly divergent from those in the southern wet tropics shaded in red. So this is just for a mitochondrial gene. We know it's the case for many nuclear genes as well. And it's, for this mitochondrial gene, whoppingly divergent, kind of like species level, if you want to use that term. So this is not just for Latoria serrata, it's for many other of these rainforest creatures that can't move around a lot. And the underlying reason for this north-south split is that we know from various lines of evidence from people's research that the wet tropics rainforest has not always been continuous like it is now. During cooler, drier periods, an example being the last glacial maxima, when the world was sort of cooler and drier and rainforest areas contracted, the wet tropics would have contracted to a core southern area and a core northern area. And if you look at the genetics of these creatures, it would look like they've spent a heck of a lot of time isolated in these areas. And then there's been these intermittent connections through the middle. such as we see now. So we see this rather tenuous connection of rainforest between Kuranda along the Black Mountain Road there. And that disappears every time conditions in the past have been too dry. So they've spent an incredible amount of time. Creatures like these frogs that can't cross the dry forest, they've been held in isolation for such extended periods. They've accumulated these very different genetic makeups, you could say. And then as rainforest then under warmer, wetter conditions in the last 10,000 years has expanded out of the northern refuge and north from the southern refuge, it's brought these lineages into contact. So we see many species where there's north-south lineage, and these species that the lineages meet in the area where we'd expect it, and we've called it a suture zone, an area with many different contact zones. The cool thing with contact zones, hybrid zones, is that they're like these natural laboratories kind of thing. You can look at all these speciation processes because lineages of all different divergences are coming in contact there, and all sorts of different outcomes are possible. So outcomes could include them just meeting and basically lots of gene flow between them and a bit of a merging. You could get some amount of selection against hybridization, but then that continued gene flow coming in from the parental populations, which could form a stable cline, or you could have speciation, even polyploid speciation, which you see in plants a lot more than you do in animals. So during my PhD, I studied the hybrid zone in Serrata, the green-eyed tree frog. Something really interesting, though, that made this hybrid zone particularly interesting is it's not just the expected north-south hybrid zone. So this red southern lineage is from Paloma near Townsville, all the way, here's Cairns, all the way to Lamb Range here, and where it meets the northern blue lineage, which is then going all the way up to near Cooktown. So that's the expected contact. The unexpected is that there's an isolated population of the southern lineage within that northern lineage area. And it's hard to know exactly how that came about, whether it was a small persistent population along the Barren there, whether they hung on the Barren in a little refuge, or whether they were, I suspect they might have been pinched off during that reconnection phase. But it offered this incredible situation where you get two hybrid zones for the price of one right in one area. So I studied them hard. I looked at all the things that happen when two lineages come back together. I did experimental crosses to see what just the background effect of having such different genomes is. Turns out you can only breed successfully in one direction. If a southern female breeds with a northern male, it predictably fails after about 10 days. It's just an absolute dead end. The reverse cross leads to lots and lots of abnormalities. And the more we look at it now with SNPs and at the genomic level, we're seeing that there is not a lot of hybridization successful at either contact. So there's strong selection against hybridization. And what happened in the system, though, to abbreviate the whole thing, is that the little isolated southern population up here in the Kuranda area, that selection against hybridization drove a relative fitness advantage to those males that have the more divergent call and the females that choose that more different call, because they're the ones avoiding those hybrid mistakes. So all those making hybrid mistakes are not having high fitness. All those that just because they've got slightly more different calls to the south, to the northern type, they're more likely to get chosen by females and have successful outcomes. That process is called reinforcement. And what I demonstrated during my PhD is that very rapidly, that population has adapted to its environment, in this case, another lineage, and the male call is driven selection on male call and female choice for that call, so that they are reproductively isolated there based on call. Not only did it drive reinforcement speciation of this population from northerns, it pushed that to such an extent that there was the incidental effect that they don't choose to reproduce with their main range down here. So they're even speciated from the rest of the southern lineage. And that is a species I then described as Latoria myola, the Kuranda tree frog. And that speciation event has probably happened since the reconnection of those rainforests, so within the last 10,000 years. So that's a very recent speciation event, and that's well and truly in the time period, for example, that people have been living in the Kuranda area. So we're still working on this hybrid zone system, but in a lot of detail now at the genomic level to try and understand what the particular genes involved in that myola speciation event have been, and what's going on at this main contact here. And if you want to read any more about the reinforcement story and associated contact zone stuff there, and a lot of that genomic research, keep an eye out for. It'll from Megan Higgy, Lorenzo Bertola, Nick Bale and myself over the next year or so. So in terms of this talk, the cool thing with all that was that it showed us that it's not just old stuff, there's still actual like adaptation and speciation happening right here in the wet tropics now, like right on the doorstep of Cairns, just up at Kuranda there. And it also shows that hybrid zones are areas of evolutionary novelty. So they're really important areas to consider for conservation. You shouldn't just focus on those core areas, because those intermediate areas can have these places where adaptation is particularly happening because of the effective species interactions. Okay, so during my PhD, I started to I'd always been kind of like coming up to the wet tropics, and then I started looking to the north thinking, oh, I should sort of like check out some of these Cape York rainforests. They look really, really interesting. It looks so fragmented up there. And in particular, I got interested in the area that's, you'll know Macarath Range and Iron Range. I got interested in the rainforest, the rocky rainforest just to the north and west of those in the Pasco River area. And I was interested in those because I could see on Google Earth and that there was a lot of rocky country there, and driving past Mount Tozer going to Iron Range, you could see all these bouldery areas. And I thought, well, that looks like it. If you don't have a lot of rainforest, what I was starting to realize is that you want a lot of rock, because rock has that buffering effect of keeping fire out, keeping things a bit more stable for moisture and temperature. So we sort of got to this idea that there can be lithorefugia out there, rocky areas that enable a persistence of rainforest lineages, because the rock's doing a lot of that buffering to the temperature, and particularly in those dry periods. So a friend and I, Kieran Allen, did a couple of trips where we just kind of got dropped off, hiked around for a few days, and then picked up again. And we were particularly focusing on these rocky areas. So you sort of head off, and like that's what you really want to see. You can't see it very well in this hazy image, but in real life, you can see these great big boulder fields coming down, which are just millions of rocks all over these slopes with rainforest associated with them. Just perfect for these tiny little refuges that might have hung on to interesting species. When you get in there, there's these incredible environments where it's just piles and piles of granite boulders that just go down and down and down. You can just keep climbing down, and it's just festooned with creepers and ferns and everything like that. Like crazy treacherous, because you could fall down any of those holes, and half the time you can't even see what you're standing on because it's just this vegetation everywhere. We did this in the pouring rain because we're particularly interested in the frogs. Got lots of interesting records, including even the first records of green pythons north of the Pasco River. So interesting records like that. And also, but the most exciting thing of all was finding 2 undescribed frog species in those 2 areas of this bouldery country. So this is what that habitat looks like that they love. And these frogs that I'm going to show you, they're those nursery frogs again, Cofix, the ones I was telling you about on the mountaintops. And the way they can survive in these incredible boulder fields is because of that terrestrial breeding. There's no standing water in these boulder fields. They just tuck their egg clutches in moist rock cracks, and then the male just protects those eggs from ants. A student working with me, Geordie Grofen, is looking at what those males actually do there. I mean, is it just protection? Are they hydrating them? Can they even move the eggs and stuff like that? So we're currently learning a lot more. But the interesting thing with that obscure breeding biology, it allows you to inhabit areas that you wouldn't normally think of as good breeding grounds for frogs. So here's one of the frogs, a big pale one. We named it Cofix Kulakula. The name Kulakula is local language. The name was derived in collaboration with the traditional owners. Kulakula means rocky place, and it's the area where we found those frogs. And here's the other one, even bigger, and that one's Cofix Pakai colungan, which is the hidden in the rocks, put together as the species name, once again derived with the local traditional owners. So 2 really cool frogs. The interesting thing is that's where one is, and that's where Pakai colungan is. They're like 5 million years divergence from each other when we look at them genetically. So everything in these landscapes can be so incredibly old. It's not a great distance between them, but they've been doing that for a long, long time. Okay, so moving to the really interesting part of this whole story is that What I haven't really said about Cofix nursery frogs is that most of them are these tiny little rainforest frogs, about 1 or 2 centimetres long. They live in the leaf litter in the rainforests. So that's most of them. That's all these ones in white in the wet tropics. There's 12 species in the wet tropics. It's the 2 that are described from Macarath Range. Then there's these 5 species on the Cape that live in Boulder Fields. And they're all absolute giants compared to the rainforest ones. Same genus, they're still Cofix nursery frogs, but they're giants and they all live in these Boulder Fields. So Black Mountain, you guys will know well, a lot of you near Cooktown, that has one, Cofix saxatilis. Cape Melville has 2 that co-occur there, one of which will be part of, Petrophilus will be part of a story later on. And there's the other one is Cofix wyphili. So if you line them up against each other, you have many species of these small rainforest ones. Then you have 5 species of these large boulder ones. And the average size of those large boulder ones is about 3 times the length and about 15 times the mass of those, the average of the rainforest ones. And if you compare the smallest rainforest one at 0.3 grams to the biggest boulder one, Pakai colungan, at 12.6 grams, that frog is about 40 times larger than the little rainforest one. It would eat that rainforest one. So it's really cool. You look at them and you think, isn't that just like astonishing? How does it even work? And then you realise the most amazing thing is I've actually now, with collaborators, completed many hundreds of genes phylogeny for all these microhalid frogs in Australia and New Guinea, which finally allows us to understand who's related to who in these Australian ones. Crazy thing is, those boulder species have evolved to giants at least 3 times independently. So they're not all each other's closest relatives. So the 2 up on the Cape there that I was just talking about the discovery of, Kulakula and Pakai colungan, their closest relative is Cofix infacetus in the wet tropics lowlands. Cofix wyphili and Petrophilus at Cape Melville, their closest relative is a couple of the widespread species in the wet tropics, Australis and ornatus. And saxatilis at Black Mountain, its closest relatives are in the rainforests of the mountains around Black Mountain. So incredibly, this giant boulder form has been a repeated outcome, an independent outcome of getting marooned in these boulder fields. So when I showed you this picture before, most people would look at this and just think they're closely related and they're closely related. The relationships there are not vertical, they're horizontal. I'm showing the frogs that are closely related across the page there. Truly amazing, hey? So what's happened on Cape York is that over millions of years, rainforest has just contracted out of that landscape. It's just too dry under current climates. Rainforest is gone. There would have been just dramatic loss of Cofix frogs across Cape York as the rainforest disappeared. And the places where they could persist and hang on were around these rock refuges, these big boulder piles. And over millions of years, in each place where these little rainforest frogs became marooned and associated with these boulder piles, they then evolved to this giant boulder morphology independently at least 3 times. So basically, to get these giant boulder frogs, you just need a whole lot of deeply piled granite and a whole lot of time, and a whole lot of isolation probably too. So yeah, really incredible species and a really amazing adaptation story. So off the back of that, I started to get interested in Cape Melville because that's like the mother of all boulder fields. It's just immense. And it wasn't like Cape Melville was already pretty well known. Like it's a huge boulder field. The cool thing about Cape Melville, it's really, really isolated rainforest there associated with these boulders. So the northern end of the wet tropics up towards Cooktown, here's Macarath Range and the Cape York rainforests. Cape Melville sits in all this dry country out here, just as a small area of rainforest associated with these massive boulder fields. It was already famous because Foxtail Palms only come from Cape Melville. So now you might have parked your car underneath one out here. People are parking their car under them in Milan and Florida and wherever else across the world, but they only come from Cape Melville. So it's got to be one of the proportionally greatest increases in distribution of any species in the world, from a speck of a place to global, just like we're doing with Wallamai pines and Pinus radiata and stuff like that. So Wallamai pines, an incredible endemic to Cape Melville. It was also known to us kind of reptile and frog nuts for a few reptile and frog endemics. A very cool big frog called Latoria andromarlin. One of those nursery frogs, the big boulder one I told you about before, Cofix Nursery, and a skink, that Cryptoblepharus thuni, that just lives on the boulders there. So it already had like a big tick against its name for endemism. I went there in the early 2000s. All those species that I've just mentioned there, you can get them down in the lowlands of Cape Melville. They're hidden amongst the boulders, particularly where creeks are coming out. This boulder field's so big, it actually has creeks sort of coming out the base of it. It's incredible. In the early 2000s, when I went there, I stood on this beach here and looked up at the boulder fields, and I had this was before sort of Google Earth imagery and all that. I had my topo map, and I could see that there looked like a bit of a plateau on top. And when I looked through my binoculars, it surprised me that it didn't go boulders, 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 and then like presumably all boulders behind, like all the other boulder fields. There was this ribbon of rainforest vegetation across the top. And I thought, that's a bit weird. Imagine if there was like a little rainforest plateau up there. It could be incredible. I tried to walk up, but it's full on. Like the boulders just get bigger to the point where you're just like climbing over houses or something. So I gave up on that, and I decided that one day I had to somehow get my way in there by helicopter. That day came because in the year 2013, I was finishing up a frog disease grant. You would have heard of chytrid fungus, devastated frog populations across the world, including the wet tropics. The northern limit of chytrid fungus in Australia is Cooktown. And I was interested, with the last bit of money I had on that grant, of trying to see if the little rainforest isolates north of Cooktown did or didn't have chytrid. And the next two to look at were Altamui Range near Melville and Cape Melville. So I thought, well, here we go. I can finally justify dumping a fair bit of money on a helicopter flight to Cape Melville, where I can swab lots and lots of frogs. And it turns out they don't have chytrid, which is good. Mostly I focused on andromarlin because it's a stream breeding frog. But really I had the motive of trying to get up to the top to go look for see what on earth was going on at the top. I flew in, I didn't fly in, I sat next to a pilot flying in. And when we got there, to my dismay, the whole top of the place was covered in cloud. And we kind of poked around for ages and ages, landed the helicopter, waited a couple of hours. That cloud was not moving. So I had to give up. I mean, these places make their own cloud, right? Because it's all that moisture-laden air is coming in and it's just forming as it's going over the top. See, it's not like you're just hoping a cloud moves away. It's making that cloud. So we camped mid-elevation up on some boulders there. And of course, the minute the chopper left, it all cleared up. But once again, we couldn't get up. It was it's really, really intense. And on the second night at like 4 a.m., a little rain shower went over. It was too hot in my tent, so I was just sleeping out on the rock and I got drenched. And then as I was like packing up all my wet stuff, this frog call started up down in the boulders just by me. That was completely different to anything. I knew it straight away. It was something that was undescribed. So I climbed down in the rocks and found this really cool looking blotchy boulder frog, which is one of those Cofix boulder frogs that was in that Boulder Frog convergence giant story before. So that was really exciting. I also collected some snails while I was there. That turned out the snail guy at the Queensland Museum, John Stanisic, said that they were the most exciting snails he'd seen in his 30-year career. And they got their own genus and everything. So straight away pointing out Cape Melville being super unique. So what happened then was I was sitting in the helicopter flying back thinking, now I really can't, I definitely don't have any money now. So this has already cost me more than I thought it was going to cost me. Now I've got to get back. And one of those uncanny, strange things happened the week I was back in the office. A National Geographic photographer called Tim Lehman emailed me out of the blue. I didn't even know the guy. I knew him actually because he has incredible bird of paradise photos and other things that I thought were amazing. So he emailed me saying he was doing a story for National Geographic on Cape York. Could he pay me for 2 weeks to take him around Cape York and show him green pythons and palm cockatoos and all that stuff? So I sort of thought, I saw my opportunity and I said, I'll give you a week for free if you find the money to get us back to Cape Melville, and I guarantee it's going to be pretty interesting for your story. He basically emailed me back that day saying, how much does it cost? So just like a couple of weeks later, back in a helicopter with Tim and a Nat Geo producer, flying back to Cape Melville. And this time it was all clear and sunny and beautiful and perfect. And flying around over the place, it's just incredible. It's, you just can't imagine how bizarre and different this place is. It's just millions and millions of boulders piled up to an elevation of 500 and something meters. Really, really incredible. And then when we came over to the main part, indeed, there is a wonderful but very, very small little plateau of rainforest, completely surrounded by these walls of boulder fields. So I was very excited. Next step, though, was trying to actually get to that rainforest, because you can't land the helicopter in the rainforest and the boulders are tricky. So we buzzed around for ages and eventually chose this whopping big boulder here. You can see the size of these things. That's 2 people and all our gear, and the helicopter was comfortably landing here. Issue number 2 was actually leaving that boulder. The helicopter flew away, and then we had to leave that boulder and try and get to the rainforest, which turned out I was all like overly confident. Yeah, see you later. This is all good. We're fine. Turned out it was very tricky, but it did happen. And then there was a few days of exciting exploring up there. And indeed, Cape Melville turned out to be a lost world, in the sense that when you walk around up there, the first lizards and things you're seeing are undescribed. Like, you straight away, oh my gosh, I don't know that skink. That one's new to science. So is that one. And over the next couple of days, really in that first day, found 5 reptile and frog species new to science up there. So there's this one that you already know. That one turned out to be common up the top there in the deep boulder fields. It's living, both those boulder, I actually got to know these frogs pretty well when I was up there, because you see a lot of them. And they do this interesting thing where it always puzzled me that, since I found it, why there were 2 living side by side. And it turns out they do, in the day, they live side by side deep down in the boulder fields, like way, way down. And when it's just getting dusk and dark, they come up commuting past you. So you can just sit in the rocks and you can see these little frogs coming up, and there's lots of them, and they commute past you on the rocks. And when they get to the top, this one, Petrophilus, which I named Petrophilus means rock-loving, it goes out onto the exposed boulder fields. And the other one, Zweifeli, it goes onto the rainforest vegetation next to the boulder fields. So they coexist in this really interesting way. This beautiful golden skink was jumping around on the rocks up there. It's a Saproscincus, which the closest relatives are on the mountains in the wet tropics. I named that one Saltus, like leaping, because it's a very agile Saproscincus, really long limbs. A really cool type of Glaphromorphus, a big reduced limb skink that lives in all the mulch that collects between the boulders. And this one, Glaphromorphus otholani. So this was named in collaboration with the traditional owners there, in reference to an elder. And then a beautiful rainbow skink, once again, named in reference to an elder, Carlia wandolfini, running around. That's the only one that's not really on the rocks. It's just running around through the rainforest at the top. Its closest relative is the red-throated skink, Carlia rubricularis encrypta, that you see in the wet tropics here. And then in my wildest dreams, I'd always hoped that maybe, seemed like a slim chance, but just maybe there could be a population of leaf-tailed geckos on top of Cape Melville. And I didn't find them for the first day and night, but then on the second night, on the very highest, very wettest ridge, got big red eye shine, and there was this absolutely incredible big leaf-tailed gecko, big, gangly, big-eyed leaf-tailed gecko with an elaborate frilly tail, like a mythical creature living up there. And many, many hours of survey effort later, it turns out that we can only find them in this one tiny little wettest, highest ridge, and we've never seen more than 10 individuals. And they're all the individuals we've ever found have been probably, like maybe 5 times this room area, that kind of thing. So it's just in that one little refuge at the top. It's not to say it may not turn up in some of the other ridges, but we've had a look at a lot of the good ones. Salturarius eximius became a bit of a media sensation at the time, and which is good. Like, it started to, even to the world, showed some of our really cool, highly localized endemics on top of these mountains. Okay, so that was 5 species added to the list for Cape Melville, on top of the 3 vertebrates already known. So it turns out Cape Melville has at least 8 endemic vertebrates. So endemics per unit area, that's got to be some of the highest in the world. And most of those are just in that tiny top area. And in 2013, Harry Hines and I went back and did some plant collecting and turned up a new plant, a Plectranthus. And so add the Plectranthus and the Foxtail Palms, and it's going to be a lot of endemics there. So in 2019, I did a trip again with traditional owners and some botanists, including from the herbarium here, and some invertebrate lovers. And this is every possibility some more new species will come out of those collections too. So it really shows how such a tiny place has had such incredible persistence and is of such high conservation value. The other interesting thing, it also fits into that rock adaptation story. Most of the species there, the vertebrates at least, are highly adapted to the rocks. They live directly on them. It's probably the only way they've persisted there in any numbers through time, particularly, like, it hasn't always been as good for rainforest, but during those tough times for rainforest, you probably needed to buffer yourself in the rock. They're bigger, they're longer limbed, they're much bigger eyed, a whole lot of quite consistent adaptations to living on these granite boulder fields. So one of the really important things about that, it shows just how special tiny places can be along the Queensland coast rainforests. And it sort of gets us thinking about, you know, there's been such incredible persistence of these species over millions of years in these places, but are they equipped for the future? So how are these things going to handle climate change, which might be a challenge they haven't, a unique challenge they haven't had. Pigs are all through these wet tropics mountaintops. Somehow, incredibly, pigs have found a way up onto the top of Melville and have really hammering the place. And also things like introduced diseases, like if chytrid fungus, for example, gets there. So although they've had incredible persistence to the present, you've got to be worried about a lot of these species. So I left off on this one earlier. That was the leaf-tail story down the east coast of Queensland, where you see a bunch of species mostly around those core areas. I had added Phylloresam Nicola. Then this added Eximius up at Cape Melville, but then over the last 20 years, by really exploring a lot of these small rainforest patches, I've discovered or been part of the discovery of quite a number of other leaf-tailed geckos. And now there's this picture of leaf-tailed gecko diversity down the coast that really highlights the importance of a lot of these small isolates. And one of the conservation threats for these guys will turn out to be fire. So they're to some degree buffered by rock, but a lot of they're never not associated with rainforest. You can't just get a boulder field that is just in dry country. You won't get a leaf-tailed gecko. It has to have at least some cover and association of rainforest. I don't really know why that is. It could be the moisture temperature buffering, or it could just be providing the invertebrate fauna they need to eat. But the thing is that a lot of these rainforests aren't these lush, wet rainforests. They're quite dry rainforests. And with climate change and associated extreme events like droughts and heat waves, we can certainly expect our Queensland rainforest to get chipped away at and burnt a bit more by fire. Hopefully not, but potentially a lot more. And that could turn out to be a big threat to these species. Fire carrying in from dry habitats into these drier patches of rainforest. So the persistence of these species is going to need really quite active fire management and a lot of consideration of weeds around those patches like lantana and guinea grass, which generate a lot of fuel load. So just sort of like very loosely pull it all together, some of the lessons I've learned from these adventures is that there's lots of interesting rainforest vertebrates outside of those core areas. I think when I started, I saw a lot of those smaller rainforest patches as probably more the realm of very interesting invertebrates, but the persistence of vertebrates in some of these rainforest areas has really amazed me. That frog and reptile species can persist in remarkably small areas, but typically through a long-term evolutionary association with rocky areas. So these lithorefugia really provide the buffering for them to survive in landscapes where they would otherwise have gone extinct. Adaptation is incredible, be that the rock adaptation or Litoria myola rapidly adapting to selection against hybridization. Hybrid zones are amazing. All sorts of cool stuff happens in hybrid zones, and we should be considering those areas for conservation. I've learned that I feel like nowadays I can read, like rainforest, I can sort of get a bit of a feel for it. Now that I work more in dry habitats, I find them very, very complex. There's a lot more subtlety going on that I find harder to understand. So that's become an interesting new challenge, trying to understand a lot of these drier habitats. As we all know, there's lots and lots of exciting discoveries still to be made. So the last slide here is the thinking about conservation in the future of these species. The positive for many of these species is that they're in rocky areas, which offers some natural protection. They're also often in national park because they're up on these mountaintops, for example, in the wet tropics or at Cape Melville. The negatives are that they have absolutely ridiculously small distribution. So I think 2 of the species I showed you there, and at least one more that jumps to mind straight away, have total known global distributions probably not bigger than this campus. So ridiculously small distributions, hence could be subject to any one event that comes through. And the big looming thing for a lot of these that's no doubt already in progress is climate change impacts for Cofix on the mountaintops, Cape Melville's wet ridges and things. Fire, probably generated off the back of climate change. Introduced species. Unfortunately, wind farms, they're part of our renewable future, but wind farms also like high elevation windy areas. So it kind of puts them in conflict sometimes, or quite often with some of these upland endemics. And although these species have persisted for very long periods of time in these small fragmented populations, throw a few threats on and reduce population size to some degree, and you probably should be worrying about the genetic health of some of these populations. And one of my students, Nick Bale, is doing a project on looking at the genetic health of some of these long-term small population isolated things compared to the stuff we typically think of, which is those recently declined species down to small populations. So yeah, I've skimmed across a lot of projects, so there's a lot of people I wish to thank, and I'll leave that up there so you can look at that while I take any questions. Thank you.